or proven all 5 elements of this charge beyond a reasonable doubt, then your verdict shall be guilty of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. If, however, you find that the Commonwealth has not proven all 5 elements of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor, then you are to consider whether the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the 3 elements of the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter. If the Commonwealth has proven the 3 elements of involuntary manslaughter, then your verdict shall be guilty on the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter. If, however, you find the Commonwealth has failed to prove beyond a vehicle under the influence of liquor and the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter, then you are to consider whether the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the 5 elements of motor vehicle homicide, felony, OUI, liquor, and negligence. If the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the 5 elements of motor vehicle homicide, then your verdict shall be guilty of the lesser included offense of motor vehicle homicide, OUI, liquor, and negligence. If, however, the Commonwealth has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all elements of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor, and has failed to prove all of the elements of the lesser included offenses of involuntary manslaughter or motor vehicle homicide, felony, OUI, liquor, and negligence, then your verdict must be not guilty to count 2.
May I have just a moment?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I be heard?
Yes.
I deeply appreciate the court's additional clarifying language. I would simply ask for one very simple amendment, and that is at the top of the verdict slip that says the 2 words, not guilty. We would ask that the verdict slip read, not guilty of the offense charged or any lesser included offense. That's it. And I think that and the court's clarifying instruction would satisfy the defense. I know that's all we ask.
All right.
I can repeat that if the court wishes.
So there are some minor changes we have to make to the verdict slip anyway. Just, it has to be consistent. So the manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle is mandatory. So there needs to be some physical changes on the verdict slip. Anyway, it needs to be a colon after give offense charge. It's not complete. It doesn't have under the influence of liquor. It just says under the influence. So there are some minor changes that need to be made to the verdict slip. Does the Commonwealth oppose the suggestion made by Mr. Jackson, which seems like a reasonable one?
No, Your Honor.
All right, so it will be not guilty. So tell me again how you want it.
Shown here on the
Sure.
screen up here had
Want
guilty,
of the
the other
offense
one
charged,
guilty,
lesser
and
than this.
it was pretty confusing. Really, what they should say, if you get to this box, stop. You don't have to go any farther.
All right, I think the clarifying language that I proposed is important.
I do too, and I appreciate that. I think with that amendment to the slip and the clarifying language, I think coupling those up is exactly what the defense was asking for. I appreciate that.
So I need to clean, I'd like to send in a written copy of what I just read there. I have a couple of things bolded. I need to fix this up a little bit. I mean, it was just done quickly. The jury's been waiting. Why don't we bring them in? And I will tell them that a new verdict slip will come into them. How's that? I do, though, have to make a finding that the verdict slip as is was proper. All right, so we'll just leave it at that. I'll make the amendment that you want, but that's my finding.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just from a logistics standpoint, once the new verdict
So now to
slip
make another
is prepared and ready,
We all need to see it.
I was just going to ask, we have that email to us.
Here's the one that they
Yeah,
have
we all
that they're
we all
using
need
now.
to see
have
it.
it on
I
the
will
screen.
work with Tori. All right.
And the problem
All right, can we
was,
bring the jurors in,
one had not
please?
guilty. and
Oh,
the
I'm
other
sorry.
no,
What
one had-
suggested
one had
language on
guilty.
the cert
It's
report?
confusing, you know. Do you stop here? Do you keep going?
I'm sorry, Judge.
Any suggested language on their
You
question?
hit not
No, I
guilty.
think the
Right
court's
here, number
correct.
one,
In terms of the
no
cert
need to
report
go any
request,
farther.
the court's answer is right on point, which is you are directed to concern, you're directed to review the evidence that's in front of you, and that's it.
I'm just going to say you have all the evidence in this case. We will not give you anything. Okay.
Rise for the jury.
Maybe the jury isn't as close as people think they were going to be.
You see it?
All right. So jurors, we're in receipt of your question. Can we request the cert report detailing the search performed? I take this as a request, and the answer is that you folks, you have all the evidence in the case. So what you have is the evidence in the case. You really need evidence. But as long as I have you here, I want to clarify my instructions regarding your verdict as to count 2 of the indictment. As I instructed you yesterday, there are 2 lesser offenses of that crime, which are involuntary manslaughter and motor vehicle homicide, felony OUI, liquor, and negligence. Therefore, count 2 encompasses 3 separate charges, the most serious of which is manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. In considering count 2, you should first focus on the crime of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor, and if the Commonwealth has failed to prove that crime beyond a reasonable doubt, then you are to consider the remaining lesser included offenses in descending order. So the lead charge is manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. If you find that the Commonwealth has proven all 5 elements of this charge beyond a reasonable doubt, then your verdict shall be guilty of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. If, however, you find that the Commonwealth has not proven all 5 elements of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor, then you are to consider whether the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the 3 elements of the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter. If the Commonwealth has proven the three elements of involuntary manslaughter, then your verdict shall be guilty on the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter. If, however, you find the Commonwealth has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the crime of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor and the lesser included offense of involuntary manslaughter, then you are to consider whether the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the five elements of motor vehicle homicide, felony, OUI, liquor, and negligence. If the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt the five elements of motor vehicle homicide, then your verdict shall be guilty of the lesser included offense of motor vehicle homicide, OUI, liquor, and negligence. If, however, the Commonwealth has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all the elements of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor and has failed to prove all the elements of the lesser included offenses of involuntary manslaughter or motor vehicle homicide, felony, OUI, liquor, and negligence, then your verdict must be not guilty to count two. So I'm going to send in a new verdict slip on count two that's just a little bit different, and we have to sort of change we have to indent something and change the spacing a little bit, make it a little bit clearer for you. Okay, so we'll see you in the next 10 minutes. All right, thank you all very much.
So new verdict slip coming now, huh? Jury is still out. And a lot of people thought they would have had this like a lot sooner.
Go be recess.
There's something right here. See if I can find it. Where was it? There we go. Hold on. I'm just getting this.
So why are we out here?
Your Honor, I just saw the verdict forms, and as we discussed yesterday, the amendments that the court indicated it would make them.
Oh, no, no.
have not been made.
Okay, I did not say I'd make it. I said I'd think about it. I said I was tired and I needed to think about it.
You said before you retired and you needed to think about it, was you agreed that there needs to be not guilty options for the subordinate count two.
I said that it made sense to me, but no, I did not change it upon looking at it because the that's to the jury is exactly.
In Massachusetts, I care about whether or not it's appropriate.
Now, this was earlier. Now, you see, I guess she probably thought better about it. Called them back in. But we'll finish this.
It's appropriate.
Different things.
It's appropriate.
Let me make my argument, if you don't mind, Judge, why it's not appropriate. For a superior charge, they have to decide that she is not guilty of the superior charge, and that is the starting point of whether or not she is guilty or not guilty of any subordinate charge, often called a lesser included. Once they decide that she's not guilty of the superior charge, now there's two additional charges that they've been instructed they must decide whether she's guilty or not guilty of. How do they decide that she's not guilty of the first subordinate charge, involuntary manslaughter?
Okay. Anything else you want to say, Mr. Jackson?
I'd like an answer from the court. How do they decide that she's not guilty of involuntary manslaughter on that verdict?
That's their decision to make.
And how do they make it if they don't have an option to check a box that says not guilty?
They don't check the box that says guilty, do they? And then when they go to the next block, they don't check the block that says guilty. And on the top, you're left with not guilty. Okay?
So it's the absence of the check mark that the court determines is the not guilty finding by the jury.
Yes, that's what the verdict slip reads. It reads not guilty. If they don't check block 2, 3, or 4, the verdict slip reads not guilty. Okay? That's how it is, Mr. Jackson.
Well, apparently that's how it's going to be because of the court's order. That is not how it should be, and it's over our strong objection. They need to see that there is a not guilty option for the subordinate charges. If they come back guilty on, for instance, involuntary manslaughter, that's immediately appealable. They didn't have an option on the verdict form to find her not guilty. It's almost like the court is directing a verdict of the subordinate charges.
Okay. I disagree with you. Ms. Giannetti, you've seen verdict slips exactly like this. Okay?
I actually haven't really.
Have you had no lesser included?
No, we've always had lesser included, but I have not seen a verdict slip there where not guilty is not an option for the rest of the
Okay. I disagree with you. All right.
I don't see the
Excuse me. This is funny, Ms. Reed. All right. We're done.
All rise for the court, please.
He said, "This is funny. Yeah, this is funny, Miss Reed. Huh?"
What is she going to be charged with and tried with the second time? Because it's double jeopardy if she's not guilty of the superior charge. They can't charge the superior charge. They can only charge the lesser included, which is obviously less jail time, less serious, things like that. But what if we just don't know? Then we could be violating those rights of the criminal defendant, which we want to make sure we don't. So why not do it right? What if anything said LSAT day got a 166, 395 GPA? You're well on your way. Go crush. Isn't the judge paid by the Commonwealth? Yeah, Charlie, but the state is, the public defenders are, and they're all in the courtroom at the same time. It's, hard to get around that paid by the government thing. April, how could she be charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter? Isn't manslaughter lesser included? Can't be convicted of both, and they are separate charges. So confused. So the elements are different. The intent is different. If you look, actually, because it's not all on the verdict form here, this is a perfect segue into us listening to the judge read some of these charges, and I will answer questions to break some of this up while we listen to her read the elements of the charges. Not all the jury instructions from yesterday, just
Oh, what happened? Yeah, I'm bad.
serious bodily harm.
In the circumstances known to the
Bad
defendant,
people.
a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. I will now discuss each of these requirements in more detail.
So Wafa said, Karen laughing is absolutely disrespectful. JOK family, you may not agree. So I said from the jump, I think it was she shouldn't laugh and the judge shouldn't call her out in the middle of court on the record. But I think, if you want my opinion on it, since you're asking, I don't think she was laughing at anything that had to do with John O'Keefe. I think she's laughing because she thinks the judge is in on it too. And she's like, of course. That's what I think the laugh was. Yobi said they're hung on the manslaughter charge because the juror is unable to accept the cover-up theory and don't know another explanation besides KR hitting JK. So that could be the case, but we got to think about the jury question. And what do we learn from the jury question? I think they're discussing the cover-up. And I think maybe a juror is in there arguing for the defense saying, it was a cover-up. Think about that CERT team, shoulder to shoulder. They searched everywhere and they didn't find it. The only explanation is a cover-up. That's what it sounds like to me, is evidence that a juror or multiple jurors are used to try to convince other jurors of the cover-up. That's what it seems like to me. But you guys let me know what you think another explanation could be about asking for that cert report.
The first element is that the defendant caused the death of John O'Keefe. A defendant's act is the cause of death where the act is a natural and continuous sequence, results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended to kill John O'Keefe, or intended to cause grievous bodily harm to John O'Keefe, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. As you can see, the second element has three subparts, which I will call prongs, and the Commonwealth satisfies its burden of proof if it proves any one of the three prongs beyond a reasonable doubt. The first prong is that the defendant intended to kill John O'Keefe. This means that the defendant consciously and purposefully intended to cause John O'Keefe's death. The second prong is that the defendant intended to cause grievous bodily harm to John O'Keefe. Grievous bodily harm means severe injury to the body. The third prong is that
By the way, you'll see Yannetti looking at his computer basically the whole time, and Jackson's looking at his phone. I don't know, but I would assume, I should just say, maybe they are following word for word through these instructions. And what you'll notice is not in these instructions is what to do if it's not guilty each time, where the boxes all are.
Defendant intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. Let me help you understand how to analyze this third prong. You must first determine whether the defendant intended to perform the act that caused the victim's death. If you find that she intended to perform the act, you must then determine what the defendant herself actually knew about the relevant circumstances at the time she acted. Then you must determine whether, under the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known that the act intended by the defendant created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether Mr. O'Keefe's death was accidental because the death was caused by a negligent, careless, or mistaken act of the defendant, or resulted from a cause separate from the defendant's conduct, you may not find that the Commonwealth has proved that the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result.
So no intent, not guilty.
In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant was affected by her consumption of alcohol. If the Commonwealth has proven both elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you should return a verdict of guilty. If the Commonwealth has failed to prove one or more of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must return a verdict of not guilty. The next is manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor.
So that was all under the first one, right? So a little simpler, guilty, not guilty. Intent being the big thing there. And then obviously if she hit him with the car. But now we get to the kind of more interesting one that we had the clarifying additional language put on.
Liquor. In order to prove manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle, the Commonwealth must prove the following 5 elements.
I'm going to slow it down just a little bit, just for the important one.
First, that the defendant operated a motor vehicle. Second, that she operated the motor vehicle upon a public way or in a place in which the public has a right of access. Third, that while the defendant was operating the motor vehicle, she was under the influence of intoxicating liquor and or the percent of alcohol in the defendant's blood was a 0.08 or greater. You'll have both these choices on the verdict slip.
So she mentions the verdict slip there, how it's going to be she's impaired or it's above a 0.08. It doesn't have to be both. Some people can be above a 0.08 and not impaired. Some people can be impaired below a 0.08. If you're impaired or above a 0.08, you're guilty of DUI. Again, the other stuff is additional to this. But what I also thought was interesting there is she mentions the verdict slip, which is of course interesting. And number 2, we get some of the differences between manslaughter and intentional bad act, which is second-degree murder.
Fourth, that the defendant operated the vehicle wantonly or recklessly so as to create a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm will result to another. And fifth, that by such operation of the motor vehicle, the defendant caused the death of John O'Keefe. So to prove the first element, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was operating a motor vehicle. A person operates a motor vehicle.
I mean, just that. Just her operating the motor vehicle, I would like to have a discussion on if I was a juror. Did they prove she was the one driving? Now, the defense didn't really put up a big fight on that, and they said she did drive home. They almost maybe admitted it, but I don't even think that was absolutely clear, to be honest.
Vehicle while doing all of the
I have had cases where if it was this unclear, that would be my main argument in a DUI.
Things that drivers do as they travel on a street or highway, and also when doing any act which directly tends to set the vehicle in motion. A person is operating a motor vehicle whenever they are in the vehicle and intentionally manipulate some mechanical or electrical part of the vehicle, like the gear shift or the ignition, which alone or in sequence will set the vehicle in motion. To prove the second element, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant operated a motor vehicle in a public way. Any street or highway that is open to the public and is controlled and maintained by some level of government is a public way. This would include, for
You may
example,
take all this time to define what a public way is, right? And this is another reason why I want to listen to this and watch this. It's like, take all this time and energy. And again, I think it's important. They have to prove the elements. Let's make sure the jury knows what a public way is. But it's like, we took all the time to do that, but we couldn't take the time to make sure that they understood how to check guilty or not guilty, or what they do if they're not guilty on the superior charge, but guilty on the lesser included, or not guilty on one lesser included, but not others. We couldn't take the extra time to do that. Cried Wolf, thanks for the super chat.
interstate and state highways, as well as municipal streets and roads. In determining whether any particular street or road is a public way, you may consider evidence, if any, about whether it has some of the usual indications of a public way. For example, whether it is paved, whether it has street lights, street signs, curbing and fire hydrants, whether there are buildings along the street, whether it has any crossroads intersecting it, and whether it is publicly maintained. To prove the third element, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that while operating a motor vehicle, the defendant was under the influence of intoxicating liquor, that is alcohol, and or the percent of alcohol in the defendant's blood was a 0.08 or greater. I will now instruct you on both theories. What does it mean to be under the influence of alcohol? It is not illegal to drive after consuming alcohol as long as the operator is not under the influence of alcohol. However, neither does someone have to be drunk to be under the influence of alcohol. A person is under the influence of alcohol if they've consumed enough alcohol to reduce their ability to operate a motor vehicle safely, by decreasing their judgment, alertness, and ability to respond promptly and effectively to unexpected emergencies. The amount of alcohol necessary to do this may vary from person to person. The Commonwealth is not required to prove that the defendant actually drove in an unsafe or erratic manner, but it is required to prove that their ability to drive safely was
In fact, she drove the opposite. She controlled her car going 24 miles an hour, 60 feet, hitting exactly what she wanted to hit, right? That's the Commonwealth's theory. Doing that while under the influence.
diminished by alcohol. You may rely on your experience and common sense about the effects of alcohol. You should consider any believable evidence about the defendant's alleged consumption of alcohol, as well as the defendant's appearance, condition, and behavior. In deciding this first theory of whether the defendant operated a motor vehicle under the influence of alcohol, you may also consider whether a blood test showed that the defendant had consumed any alcohol. However, no matter what the reading is, the blood test is not sufficient itself to prove that the defendant was under the influence of alcohol. Now, under the second theory, and again, both will be on the verdict slip and you should decide each one. The Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that at the time of operation, the percent of alcohol in the defendant's blood was a 0.08 or greater. The Commonwealth may prove a person's blood alcohol level by a chemical test or analysis of their breath or blood. In deciding whether the Commonwealth has proved the defendant's blood alcohol level beyond a reasonable doubt, you may consider evidence, if any, about whether the test was administered within a reasonable time of operation of the motor vehicle, whether the person who...
Did you notice that? Whether the test was admitted in a reasonable time after operation of the motor vehicle. 9 hours. I don't understand how, like, categorically and based on precedent, that is not the case. Because it certainly does not seem like a reasonable time to me. But maybe it's because of my experience in knowing how quickly they usually do it. Maybe that's not fair. If you guys haven't hit the like button, hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe, especially if you're new. And let me know if you're newly subscribed under this trial.
who administered the test was properly certified, whether and how the pre-test procedures were followed and employed, whether the testing device was working properly at the time the test was administered, and whether the test was administered properly. You may also consider any other evidence pertaining to the test. Mr. Court Officer, I know it's traditional to not allow anybody in and out of the courtroom while I'm charging, so I'm going to ask you to follow that at this point. Thank you. It's distracting, and I don't want it to be distracting for you folks, okay? The fourth element...
Especially under this part. This is the important part.
Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant operated the vehicle wantonly or recklessly. A person drives recklessly when they ignore the fact that their manner of driving is very likely to result in death or serious injury to someone, or they are indifferent to whether someone is killed or seriously injured. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to prove that the defendant acted negligently. That is, acted in a way that a reasonably careful person would not. It must be shown that the defendant's actions went beyond mere negligence and amounted to recklessness. The defendant was reckless if she knew or should have known that such actions would pose a grave danger or death or serious injury to others, but chose, nevertheless, to run the risk and go ahead. Whenever I refer to the defendant's
AKA DUI. You chose to drink, you chose to drive, you know that's reckless.
state of mind or her intent, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant was affected by her consumption of alcohol. A defendant may have the requisite state of mind or intent even if she consumed alcohol, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved the element. Here, the defendant must have intended her acts in the sense that they were not accidental, but it is not necessary that the defendant intended or foresaw the consequences of those acts, as long as a reasonable person would know that they were so dangerous that death or serious injury would probably result. As such, the Commonwealth does not need to prove that the defendant intended to kill John O'Keefe. Rather, this is in the category of cases where public safety requires each driver, once they know what the situation is, to determine and to adhere to an objective standard of behavior.
So you didn't want to hurt anybody, but you also knew what you were doing is reckless and could hurt people, and you decided to do it anyway.
In determining whether the defendant drove recklessly, you should take into account all the facts of the situation: the defendant's rate of speed and manner of operation, the defendant's physical condition and how well the defendant could see and could control the vehicle, the condition of the defendant's vehicle, what kind of road it was and who else was on the road, what was the time of day, the weather and the condition on the road were, and what any other vehicles or pedestrians were doing, and any other factors, including the defendant's consumption of alcohol, that you think are relevant. The fifth element that the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant, by her actions, caused the death of John O'Keefe. The defendant caused the death actually and substantially set in motion the entire chain of events that produced the death. A defendant's act is the cause of death where the act, in a natural and continuous sequence, results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. If the Commonwealth has proven all five elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you shall return a verdict of guilty. If the Commonwealth has failed to prove one or more of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must return a verdict of not guilty. Now, the lesser offense of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor includes the lesser offense of involuntary manslaughter. As a matter of law, the indictment that is before you, which charges the defendant with—
So now we get, that was all voluntary. That was all, she chose to do something bad, basically. This is now transitioning into involuntary manslaughter, accidental.
With manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor also charges her with the lesser included offense. The Commonwealth may prove the lesser included charge of involuntary manslaughter, even if it fails to prove the greater charge of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. So I will define involuntary manslaughter. To prove that the defendant is guilty of involuntary manslaughter because of wanton or reckless conduct, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant caused John O'Keefe's death. Second, that the defendant intended—
That's obviously the big common theme through all this, that she was actually the cause of his death.
the conduct that caused John O'Keefe's death. Third, that the defendant's conduct was wanton or reckless. I will now discuss each element in more detail. The first element is that the defendant caused the death of John O'Keefe. Remember, Ms. Reed caused John O'Keefe's death if her actions directly and substantially set in motion the entire chain of events that produced the death. A defendant's act is the cause of death where the act, in a natural and continuous sequence, results in death and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended the conduct that caused the death. The Commonwealth is not required to prove the defendant intended to cause the death.
Basically, just she intended to reverse backwards in her car at high rates of speed. Nick, I mean, this is the ultimate question. This is the ultimate question. This is how the jury should look at it. We'll see if they actually do.
May consider any credible evidence that the defendant was affected by her consumption of alcohol. The third element is that the defendant's conduct was wanton or reckless. Wanton or reckless conduct is conduct that creates a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm will result to another. It is conduct involving a grave risk of harm to another person that a person undertakes with indifference or with disregard of the consequences of such conduct. Whether conduct is wanton or reckless depends either on what the defendant knew or how a reasonable person would have acted knowing what the defendant knew. If the defendant realized the grave risk created by her conduct, her subsequent act amounts to wanton or reckless conduct, whether or not a reasonable person would have realized the risk of grave danger. Even if the defendant herself did not realize the grave risk of harm to another, the act would constitute wanton or reckless conduct if a reasonable person, knowing what the defendant knew, would have realized.
So it's a reasonable person standard.
the act posed a risk of grave danger to another. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to prove the defendant acted negligently, that is, in a manner that a reasonably careful person would not have acted. The Commonwealth must prove that the defendant's actions went beyond negligence and amounted to wanton or reckless conduct, as I have defined them. In deciding whether the defendant knew or should have known her conduct created a high degree of likelihood that substantial harm would result to another, you may consider credible evidence that the defendant was affected by her consumption of alcohol.
All right, let's answer a couple questions here to break this up. Kimberly said, mass government template has check only one of the following 4 choices and then number 1, not guilty. I like that too. Only one of the following 4 choices. So you know, if you check not guilty, you don't check any other ones. I like that. What stops the court from changing the verdict slip? Just the court. The Middleman podcast. What evidence did the jury want to see? The CERT report, basically, of when they did that search with the experts there, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, searching every inch of where they thought they could expect to find evidence based on what the cops told them. Jay, do you expect a civil suit against Karen Reed from the O'Keefes if found not guilty? I don't know if I expect it. I mean, again, all of the media and the pressure and the stuff happening, it makes it more likely, but do they really want to keep going through this? That would make it less likely. Does the jury question indicate what they're thinking? There's a lot of questions like this. Chris asked, Peter, any guess on why the jury want to see the CERT report? So I kind of made mention of it before. To me, it makes it seem like somebody is arguing for the cover-up and using this as part of their argument and saying, look, it's obviously a cover-up. They did this, didn't find anything, and then random officers driving by find stuff. Why even have a court reporter if the jury cannot look at that report? Well, for appeal. Everything on the record goes to the appellate court. If there are issues, we have to have it all typed out and recorded so that we can appeal it and know exactly what was said. In a long trial like this, it seems like unreasonable to ask for the jurors to recall the details. I agree. It's tough. It's an imperfect science, but we also don't want them to sit back there and reread the whole trial because things can come off differently when you're reading them than when you're listening to them. They take their notes. It's the best we came up with as lawyers trying to make this the best jury system we can. Why can't they see the CERT report? It's not an evidence, probably hearsay, other objectionable issues in it. The testimony is the evidence. Daybreak. Possibly Bev was reluctant to indicate form improper because to do so might provide appealable issue for lots of prior convictions in MA. I don't think she had to say it was improper, but there's nothing wrong with if a lawyer asks you to change something and you consider it and there's nothing legally wrong with it, then you can change it. It happens all the time. That we do things other than the standard verdict forms or standard jury instructions. It happens literally all the time. Also, there's a reason they're the standards and not the mandated verdict forms. So does this mean that the jury didn't have the forms yesterday? Sorry, a bit behind. Yes, I think they did have the forms yesterday. Why no CERT report isn't in evidence? No, it's not in evidence. Crypto lawyer, the fact that they're asking for the CERT report on the search gives me pause. Maybe I'm holding them too high a standard. There's one threshold issue to be decided. Did Karen Reed's car hit John O'Keefe? If not done, I honestly think the way the defense argued this case, the jury is back there asking the question, was it a cover-up? Was it the Alberts? I think they're asking each other those questions, and they're trying to figure out what did the defense prove? Even though that's not how it's supposed to be, the way the defense argued the case and presented the evidence, I think they would understand if the jury did want to look into that and see if there really was a cover-up. Or if somebody's saying, I just can't vote not guilty because I don't believe in the cover-up, and some of the jurors are like, okay, we'll prove the cover-up. Based on CERT, does it give you any insight as to what the jury's thinking? Kind of already answered that one. Was it proper for Bev to comment on Karen smiling? I think she should have, if she was going to, she should say things like, everybody needs to remain to remain respectful while they're in the courtroom. That includes the defendant, even if she wants to say something like that. Paul Printed Heart. This is crazy. I still would not know what to do. Yes, she was drinking, but how can it be if the car never hit him? Drinking part is suggestive. Yeah, but there's no just DUI on here. And I frankly don't think they proved that. All right, let's listen to more of the instructions here.
A defendant may have the requisite knowledge, even if she consumed alcohol, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved this element. Now, the offense of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor also includes the lesser offense of motor vehicle homicide, felony OUI liquor, and negligence. As a matter of law, the indictment that is before you, which charges the defendant with manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor, also charges her with the lesser included offense. The Commonwealth may prove the lesser included charge of motor vehicle homicide, even if it fails to prove the greater charge of manslaughter while operating a motor vehicle under the influence of liquor. You may find the defendant guilty of motor vehicle homicide only if you are not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of manslaughter, and you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of motor vehicle homicide. So I will define that for you now. In order to prove the defendant guilty of motor vehicle homicide, the Commonwealth must prove the
And now we're getting into another one here.
following 5 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant operated a motor vehicle. Second, that she operated the motor vehicle upon a public way or in a place in which the public has a right of access. Third, that while the defendant was operating the motor vehicle, she was under the influence of intoxicating liquor and or the percent of alcohol in the defendant's blood was 0.08 or greater. Fourth, that while operating a motor vehicle, the defendant did so in a negligent manner so that the lives or safety of the public might be endangered. Fifth, that by such operation of the motor vehicle, the defendant caused the death of John O'Keefe. Elements 1, 2, 3, and 5 are the same as manslaughter while under the influence of alcohol, as I've previously instructed you just moments ago. The difference between manslaughter while operating under the influence and motor vehicle homicide is the 4th element. To prove the 4th element of motor vehicle homicide, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant drove negligently in a manner that might have endangered the lives or safety of other people. A person acts negligently when she fails to use due care. That is, when they act in a way that a reasonable person would not act. This can happen either by doing something that a reasonable person would not do under the circumstances, or by failing to do something that a reasonable person would do. The defendant acted negligently if she drove in a way that a reasonable person would not have, and by doing so created an unnecessary danger to other people, a danger that could have avoided, that she could have avoided by driving more carefully. The defendant's intent does not matter, so do not consider it in determining whether or not the defendant was negligent. There is no requirement that the Commonwealth show that the defendant...
So this is another point here by Gemma. Another good point that they could be asking for.
Intended to act negligently or unlawfully. Under our laws, public safety requires each driver to determine and to adhere to an objective standard of reasonable behavior. Therefore, what the defendant may or may not have intended to result from her actions is irrelevant. The issue is whether...
Here's the negligent killing. So this is, I think, what most people think is the most possible is either the DUI manslaughter or this.
Whether or not she drove as a reasonable person would have under the circumstances. In determining whether the defendant drove negligently in a manner that might have endangered the lives or safety of other people, you should take into account evidence, if any, about the defendant's rate of speed and manner of operation, the defendant's physical condition, and how well she could see and control her vehicle, the condition of the defendant's vehicle, the kind of road it was, and who else was on the road, the time of day, the weather, and the road conditions, what any other vehicles or pedestrians were doing, and any other factors, including the defendant's consumption of alcohol, that you think are relevant. The next indictment is leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. In order to prove the defendant guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, the Commonwealth must prove 6 things beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant operated a motor vehicle. Second, that she operated on a public way or in a place in which the public has a right of access. Third, that the defendant knowingly collided with John O'Keefe. Fourth, that the collision caused injury to John O'Keefe.
Knowingly collided with John O'Keefe. I mean, that element, in fact, is obviously within and throughout all of these charges. So like a lot of you have already said, that's the ultimate question. They have to consider that. That's ultimately where I turned once we heard the defense experts, where it's like, I just believe the evidence points to it's more likely than not, and I'll just give a civil standard, it's more likely than not that she didn't hit the car, that she didn't hit him with her car. And if that's more likely than not, it has to be not guilty.
Keefe, resulting in his death. And fifth, that after causing such injury, the defendant failed to stop and provide name, home address, and registration number of the motor vehicle. And sixth, that the defendant failed to do so for the purpose of avoiding prosecution or apprehension. Jurors, I've already instructed you on the first and second elements. The other 4 elements should be given their plain meaning, and the parties agree that I do not need to define them any further. Save a little time for you. As a general rule, you are permitted but not required to infer that a person who intentionally uses a dangerous weapon on another person intends to kill that person or cause him grievous bodily harm, or intends to do an act which, in the
and as we're listening to this, there's only a couple minutes left. You'll notice the lack of explanation of the point that she ends up clarifying on, which this is highlighting the importance of the clarifying instruction and the change made to the verdict form.
Circumstances known to him, a reasonable person would know creates a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. An item that is normally used for innocent purposes can become a dangerous weapon if it is used in a dangerous or potentially dangerous fashion. The law considers an item, in this case a motor vehicle, to be used in a dangerous fashion if it is used in a way that it reasonably appears to be capable of causing serious injury or death to another person. In deciding whether an item was used as a dangerous weapon, you may consider the circumstances surrounding the alleged crime, the nature, size, and shape of the item, and the manner in which it was handled or controlled. Now that completes the second part of my instructions. I will now turn to the final instructions. In order for a jury to return a verdict, that is to reach a decision in a criminal case, the law provides that there may only be 12 persons on the deliberating jury, and you will note that there are still 14 of you. To avoid the need for a new trial, if one or more jurors becomes ill or has to be excused for some good reason, we customarily impanel extra jurors at the beginning of a trial, as we did in this.
So I'm going
Therefore,
to
the
skip,
conclusions of
I'm
my
gonna skip the part about picking the alternate jurors, but I think there's a final instruction right near the end of this that I want to listen to as well. Denise said, is she charged with DUI? If so, what about all of the drunk cops? So DUI is part of the manslaughter and the killing, and her frame of mind and her reckless decision-making and things like that. She's not just charged with simple driving under the influence or operating under the influence.
the deliberations, communicating with the court if necessary during deliberations,
Here
and
we go.
questions the
This is what
jurors
I wanna
select their own anyone, including each other. The jury starts deliberating. As indicated, it is important that we have extra jurors in the case of emergency. If we did not impanel extra jurors and a juror became ill or for some other reason had to be excused, we would have to try the case all over again with a new jury. In the event that a juror has to be excused once the jury starts deliberating, then an alternate juror will be chosen to take that juror's position, and the jury will be required to start their deliberations all over again from the very beginning. Therefore, it is important that the alternates not discuss the case with anyone, including each other, for if an alternate becomes a member of the jury for deliberations, the alternate's views should be his or her own and not influenced by anyone else. Now, different states and jurisdictions use different means to select a foreperson of the jury. In some jurisdictions, the jurors select their own foreperson. In Massachusetts, the judge is responsible for selecting a foreperson. A foreperson of a jury has been described as the first among equals. He or she is responsible for organizing the deliberations, communicating with the court. The judge is responsible for selecting a foreperson. A foreperson of a jury has been described as...
See, so it says in the instructions, the judge is responsible for selecting the foreperson. I did want to hear that because there was some discussion about that. I agree, ZHY. They have all the evidence. They have all the power. They have all the resources. They should choose what to say, think that they can prove. What this does, in my opinion, is it enhances and encourages overcharging because you know you can just get them for the lesser included later. And it forces people sometimes into plea agreements that they otherwise would not agree to.
First among equals. He or she is responsible for organizing the deliberations, communicating with the court if necessary during deliberations, and presenting the verdict following your deliberations. The foreperson has no greater say or vote in the jury's deliberations, however, in that sense is exactly equal with all the jurors. I am going to ask juror in seat number 1, juror number 400. Would you be our foreperson, please, sir? Thank you. When you return to the jury room to deliberate, the court officers will deliver to you all of the exhibits in this case.
Just so you know, he could have said no. He could have said no, and then she would have moved on to the next person that she wanted to pick.
As well as the verdict slips that you will use in returning your verdict.
Gives the judge a lot of power. Usually we have an idea of 1 or 2 people that we think is going to be the foreperson because we pick the jury, we get to know them, you watch their mannerisms. We've seen another case of people have guessed who the foreperson is going to be based on questions and other things. So it's a lot of power for the judge to just pick who the foreperson is going to be.
Your foreperson will be given verdict slips setting forth the charges against the defendant. 12 jurors must agree before you have a decision as to any charge. That means that to find the defendant guilty, all 12 must agree.
Next.
To find the defendant not guilty, all 12
Jackson.
must agree. You should continue deliberating until you have reached a final verdict on each charge.
Verdict
You
what?
should not begin deliberating until all 12 jurors are together in the
Jackson
jury room,
goes
and
on.
should cease deliberating if any one juror is
Yes.
not present in the jury room. It is important that you not communicate with anyone
John Jackson
outside the
hit a lot of great points
jury room about the deliberations or about anything concerning this.
in his closing argument. Very good attorney.
Over and over and over, they and others were caught deceiving you. Big things, small things, it didn't really matter. They feared nothing. They'll look you in the eye and deny phone calls. They'll deny secret meetings. They'll claim that calls are butt dials and butt dials are answered. They'll show you a video and tell you left is right and right is left. They'll magically turn 3 pieces of plastic into 5 right before your eyes. And even when they're caught with their own lies, they won't blink, they don't sweat.
Okay, let me just get
They'll
this
just look you in the eye and demand, pay no attention. You folks look the other way. Ladies and gentlemen, this case, plain and simple. You'll surely say to yourself, I don't want to believe it. I don't want to believe that can happen in our community. But sadly, over the past 8 weeks, you've seen it.
Oh. Well, I screwed that up, so give me a minute. But yeah, I think they're gonna be going to lunch in a minute. For jury deliberations. The judge already said no more evidence. That's good because there really isn't much. Really isn't much evidence. He said, "Oh no, 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 no."
The City of Boston is declaring a snow emergency beginning tonight at 9 p.m.
The storm's expected to move into our region late tonight and continue to impact Massachusetts throughout Saturday and Saturday night. The rate of snowfall is expected to pick up significantly around 9 or 10 tomorrow morning.
Now we get into the real meat of this storm from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. where the snow can come down at the rate of 2 to 4 inches per hour.
2 to 4 inches an hour is basically whiteout conditions.
Here in Boston, there is a snow emergency that is in place, and that means there are parking restrictions that are also in place.
Look at the temperature at noontime tomorrow. It is dropping as that wind shifts to the north and strengthens. It pulls down the colder air. So these are going to be bands of really heavy snow, but it goes on here. Bands of snow, damaging winds through the afternoon. And this here, 9 o'clock in the evening, we're still getting it.
Because of the wind, it will be extremely hard to see anything at various points in time along the way.
And heavy wind gusts of more than 40 miles per hour, making challenging travel conditions throughout the day where it will not be possible to see the road ahead.
This is going to be a very big storm.
Many peculiar irregularities have come to light in the Massachusetts State Police investigation into Karen Reed. Upon closer examination, certain details presented to us confront our common sense and elude all logical explanation. We will present the facts to you as we understand them and let you decide for yourselves. After finding missing Boston police officer John O'Keefe's body laying nearly lifeless on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road, a 911 call was placed by Jennifer McCabe at 6:04 a.m. Moments later, Canton Police, fire and ambulance services arrived on scene to render aid to John O'Keefe. He was then transported to Good Samaritan Medical Center where he would later be pronounced dead. Once John O'Keefe left in the ambulance, responding veteran Canton police officers Lieutenant Paul Gallagher, Detective Sergeant Michael Lack, and Sergeant Sean Good began their investigation by searching for evidence. It was nearly sunrise, and the sky was getting brighter by the minute. The low wind, minimal snowfall, and early morning sunlight provided the best conditions for a police search that would be possible for the next 24 hours. Since it had only been snowing lightly up until this point, and would not start snowing heavily for another 3.5 hours, Lieutenant Gallagher was able to clear about 2 inches of accumulated snow from the crime scene with a leaf blower. Before we go any further, let's discuss all of the evidence that was present at the crime scene that day during the morning Canton PD search and the evening Mass State Police search in total, according to the Commonwealth. 1 broken cocktail-style glass. 1 men's sports shoe belonging to John O'Keefe. John's cap. 6 blood samples collected from the snow using improvised red plastic cups borrowed from a neighbor. And 37 pieces of shattered tail light plastic scattered across the crime scene. Now, envision all of that evidence on the grass surrounding John's lifeless body, precisely at the spot designated by the state of Massachusetts as the point where he came into contact with Karen Reed's taillight. This contact had such force that it resulted in the taillight explosively shattering into 37 pieces and the cocktail glass breaking. A violent impact of such magnitude that it not only knocked one of John's shoes off, but also sent his cap flying from his head. What was found by the Canton PD during the first search is quite curious. They were able to locate all of the broken cocktail glass pieces and all of the blood samples. However, of the 37 bright red tail light pieces laying in the pure white snow, they were able to find exactly 0. The Canton PD's morning search had concluded as the case was being transferred to Detective Michael Proctor of the Massachusetts State Police. As the clock neared 10 a.m., the blizzard intensified dramatically, subjecting Canton to a relentless onslaught of 2 to 4 inches of snow per hour. Throughout the day, the Massachusetts State Police Special Emergency Response Team, also known as CERT, remained on standby, poised with the command to initiate their own investigation of the crime scene. They were acutely aware that each passing minute only added to the accumulation of snow on the ground and diminished the available daylight for their search. However, CERT team leader Kevin O'Hare received a call from State Police Lieutenant Brian Tully, stating he did not have authorization to start the search yet. The relay remains unknown. At 4:55 p.m., the sun would set with nearly 21 inches of snow on the ground and more still falling from the sky. With no daylight, high winds, and at times blinding whiteout conditions, visibility could not have been worse. Authorization would finally come, and at 5:44 p.m. the CERT team, along with State Police Detective Lieutenant Brian Tully, would conduct a second search of the crime scene outside 34 Fairview Road. There is no record of the area being cordoned off since the morning search, which left it wide open for anyone to access, unmonitored until the state police arrived. Under these conditions, one wonders how they could have found anything at all. However, what the Massachusetts State Police claim to have found is truly mystifying and challenges rationality. And 20 inches more of snow, 40-mile-per-hour winds, and complete darkness. The state police claim to have found 2 bright red and 1 clear plastic pieces of shattered taillight, along with John's missing shoe. Logic would dictate that a mix of evidence should have been found by both teams. However, the fact that the morning search found all of the cocktail glass pieces indicates they did a meticulous job searching the area. Then how in the world during their 2-hour search did they miss 37 pieces of bright red shattered taillight glass, including one corner piece the size of a small teacup. And furthermore, what explains the Massachusetts State Police's ability to find them during the second largest January storm ever recorded in the Boston area? Leslie, how was the shoe missed in a few inches of snow during the morning search? Earlier that afternoon, troopers Buchanan and Proctor took a 30.5-mile drive to Karen Reed's parents' home in Dighton, Massachusetts. The stated purpose of their visit was interviewing Karen about what had occurred the evening prior. Excerpt from the Commonwealth Statement of Case, dated June 2022, and signed by Assistant District Attorney Adam C. Lally.
At approximately 4:30 p.m. on January 29th, troopers Buchanan and Proctor arrived at a residence in Dighton, Massachusetts, the home of the defendant's parents. Upon their arrival, they observed a large black Lexus SUV bearing registration 3G684, registered to the defendant, parked outside the garage door in the driveway to the home. The troopers observed the rear right passenger side taillight to be shattered and a large red piece of plastic to be missing from the taillight. The black Lexus SUV was seized from the driveway of the defendant's parents' home in Dighton on January 29th as well. The vehicle was then transported via tow to the Canton Police Department.
If the troopers arrived at 4:30 p.m., interview Karen inside the home, tow her vehicle at 5:30 p.m. as claimed, and then drive 1 hour back to the Canton Police Department, it would be impossible for them to make it back before the 5:44 p.m. search begins. Which means they would have no opportunity to plant the taillight fragments. On May 2nd, 2023, award-winning journalist Aidan Kearney from Turtle Boy Daily News would break a story that would profoundly shake the foundation of the case and cast doubt on the integrity of both the Massachusetts State Police and the Norfolk District Attorney's Office. Kearney reported the existence of time-stamped video footage from the Reeds' home, showing Karen's vehicle being towed at 4:12 p.m. And he would go on to report more evidence in the form of public records requests to the Dighton Police Department, ultimately proving that the troopers arrived at 3:27 p.m. and were gone by 4:17 p.m. This means Trooper Proctor and the vehicle were unaccounted for a period of 1 hour and 18 minutes, and that they had plenty of time to reach the crime scene before the 5:44 search began. And that they lied about the timeline on official court documents in a murder trial. Quoting Aidan Kearney, "What these people are doing is evil and tyrannical, and we will never stop exposing their lies until each and every person who helped cover up the murder of John O'Keefe is criminally charged." There are lingering questions. Why did the Massachusetts State Police decide to tow Karen's vehicle to the Canton Police Department, especially given that it was no longer an active Canton police investigation? After all, there were many state police facilities in the area that would have been easier to travel to during a historic winter storm. Could the reason have been that the Canton police station is located a mere 1.4 miles from the crime scene, and troopers Proctor and Buchanan had a small, closing window of time to get there before the evening search commenced. And as first reported by Turtle Boy Daily News, why, in a recent court document, has the Commonwealth discreetly revised their timeline of these events, over a year after they were affirmed as factual by Assistant District Attorney Adam Lally and District Attorney Michael W. Morrissey. Why didn't Lucky see a body on the lawn? Why was the Ford Edge parked in front of the crime scene for over an hour at 2:30 a.m.? Why did Jennifer McKay Google how long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m.? Where is all the missing evidence? Why weren't all of the people present in the house that night interviewed, and why was it never searched? With Aidan Kearney's investigative work exposing the inconsistencies and misdeeds surrounding the case, the truth has become increasingly undeniable. The legacy of Officer John O'Keefe has become a symbol of the enduring pursuit of truth and justice, and his memory serves as a reminder of the power of interested citizens, coupled with relentless investigative journalism.
There is no actual emergency.
Peter Murphy, retired police sergeant from the town of Canton. From what I've seen, my training and experience, it's hard to buy into the program that they're promoting right now. So, the prosecution and DA Morrissey's office. I can't see it. I mean, like everybody else, bought into it. I said, it's the police department. I worked there for 30 years. Yeah, must be the real deal. It must be true. Yeah. And then they with the defense, and I saw the autopsy picture of the arm. There's no way. And then, of course, all the collateral, peripheral nonsense, changes, circumstances, lack of protocol followed. I actually know that personally, a gentleman that was responsible for taking the taillight out of the Lexus at the request of the state police when it was supposed to be in a barracks. Instead, it was in a Canton Sallyport. Mm-hmm. After the case was transitioned over to the state police, there's just so many inconsistencies and variables that you can't keep track of. Just basically, he said they took it out because he took it out at their request because they didn't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. I'm not a rocket scientist, but if the state police CERT team can't, or car team, whatever they call it, can't pull a taillight assembly out of a Lexus.
What year did you retire?
2010. But I mean, I can say that there was none of this nonsense going on. Yeah, I mean, there was no conflicted. I thought everybody did their job, and there was no knowledge, to my knowledge, improprieties to speak of. I don't know. I know there was a comment made recently that there was no disciplinary action taken since 2000. I would question from inside information that I personally know firsthand.
Interesting.
see y'all. Now a little Muppet Show music from Nippy Nefarious. Nippy Nefarious. Nippy Nefarious. Nippy Nefarious.
Look the other way. 4 words that sum up the Commonwealth's entire case. 4 words that sum up the hopes of those who have tried to deceive you. Conflicts of interest? Doesn't matter. Just look the other way. Magic hairs, magic glass. Look the other way. Late night calls and Google searches, falsified affidavits, inverted videos, and butt dials galore. Just look the other way. That's what they want. That's what they're counting on, but the uncontrovertible fact is you have been lied to in this courtroom. And your job is to make sure you don't ever, ever look the other way. Your singular duty is to stare down the evidence and do it unflinchingly and do it unwaveringly. You see, you're the only thing standing between Kieran Reed and the tyranny of injustice. It's your job you didn't ask for, probably a job you didn't want, but it's the greatest responsibility we have as citizens here in America, lest the government stop answering to us and we start answering to the government. And low betide any one of us who might find ourselves in the crosshairs of a Michael Proctor. Preparing for today, I was reminded of a quote. It's a quote about the truth, and I want to share it with you. It is of great importance to set a resolution never to tell an untruth. There is no vice so mean, so pitiful, so contemptible, and those who permit themselves to tell a lie once find it much easier to do it a second time and a third. This falsehood of the tongue leads to that of the heart, and in time, it depraves all its good dispositions. What does that mean? It means that it's been observed that to tell an untruth, to exaggerate, to make a false claim,
Big shout out,
cancer.
699.
One lie begets another, and it's a malignancy that grows over time.
Definitely share.
And that, folks, is how a cover-up is born.
699.
That's how a
One
Massachusetts
more.
state trooper says in whispered tones to his friends when he thought no one was looking or listening, how he would make a case, how he would make it cut and dry, no matter the truth, how he would make sure to put, quote, serious charges on the girl. In other words, pin it on the girl.
There we are, 700.
You may ask yourself, how does this happen? How could this happen? It's 2024. Surely people aren't going to come to this courtroom, this hall of justice, and lie to us, just give us false information. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't try to cover up the truth. The Alberts, the McCabe's, Higgins, Lank, Michael Proctor, Yuri Buchanan, Brian Tully. You don't have to wonder if they would lie to support their narrative. You need only wonder how many times they did lie. Over and over and over, they and others were caught deceiving you. Big things, small things, it didn't really matter. They feared nothing. They'll look you in the eye and deny phone calls. They'll deny secret meetings. They'll claim that calls are butt dials and butt dials are answered. They'll show you a video and tell you left is right and right is left. They'll magically turn 3 pieces of plastic into 5 right before.
He said, "They say butt dials are called and butt dials are answered." He said, "Your butt's in bed. Your phone's on the nightstand, and you still figured a way to butt dial." Brian Alves said when he was doing the naughty.
Before your eyes. And even when they're caught with their own lies, they won't blink, they don't sweat. They'll just look you in the eye and demand, pay no attention. You folks look the other way. Ladies and gentlemen, there was a cover-up in this case, plain and simple. You'll surely say to yourself, I don't want to believe it. I don't want to believe that could happen in our community. But sadly, over the past 8 weeks, you've seen it right before your eyes. So how does a cover-up happen? How could that happen? Well, let's count the ways, shall we? Handpick your investigator. Make sure it's someone we know, someone on our side. Keep him close. Offer him help. Offer him a gift.
Well, you did
Have
that in
secret
Michael
friends and family
Proctor.
meetings. Get your story straight. Delete your call history. Make mysterious phone calls at 2:22 a.m. Delete Google searches. Monitor police activity. Get rid of evidence. Get rid of your
Not
dog.
long to die in the
Destroy your
cold.
phones. Destroy your SIM card. For the investigator, decide on a narrative early on. Don't go to the crime scene. Don't take witnesses in for questioning. Question all the witnesses together. Ignore witnesses who don't fit your narrative. Allow friends and family to contact those same witnesses. Don't record interviews. Write vague and false police reports. Omit witnesses' names. Omit witnesses' interviews altogether. Don't photograph the evidence. Don't conduct any forensics. Don't document the evidence. Don't document the logs. Don't create any logs whatsoever, and don't maintain a chain of custody. Keep all the evidence in the hands of one person and then manipulate that evidence, including videos. Don't turn over videos. Invert videos. Turn 4:16 p.m. into 5:30 p.m. in affidavits. Turn 3 pieces of taillight into 5 pieces of taillight. Delete 42 minutes of surveillance footage. Hide personal relationships. Make this case cut and dry and ensure the homeowner, quote, never sees any shit because he's a Boston cop. But most importantly, pick your patsy and pin it on the girl. It's not that it could happen. It's that every single one of those things I just mentioned did happen right in front of you. But this sort of injustice can't happen in a vacuum. So what about the prosecution? What about the Commonwealth? What does it look like when the government picks a narrative and then tries to form a prosecution around the narrative instead of the other way around? Looks a lot like this. If you don't have actual evidence, just throw every single thing you can against the wall to see what sticks. Drag her through the mud and make sure you attack her character. And that's what you saw in this case. The Commonwealth spent much of their time and resources trying to vilify Karen Read. They desperately resorted to calling witnesses to talk about Karen Read and John O'Keefe's arguments. They even stooped so low as to call the children and put them through this ordeal. All to say that John sometimes got upset because Karen was too kind, too nice, spoiled them too much. Their arguments illustrated what anybody could imagine is a normal set of ups and downs for any couple. Even on January 28th, they talked it out, they communicated, they worked out their issues, and they had a nice, affectionate evening out with their friends. And you don't have to take my word for it. Pull the tape, as they say. Look at the videos. C.F. McCarthy, Waterfall. What are the words that every single person who testified in this case used about Karen Reed and John O'Keefe that night? Getting along, no issues, good mood, happy, affectionate, even lovey-dovey. No issues, no toxicity. They were a loving couple right up into the time Karen Reed dropped him off and he walked into 34 Fairview. If an argument with a loved one is a motive for murder, folks, we're all in trouble. Speaking of which, what is the evidence that John went into the house? The Commonwealth will tell you, undoubtedly, no, he never went in the house. And they'll point to certain witnesses who they say didn't see him go in. Well, the question you have to ask yourself is, can you rely on that? First, these are all people who are related to or committed to the Alberts in some way or another. That all-powerful Canton family, it's easy to say, I didn't see something, because how can that really be challenged? Some actually may not have seen John walk into the house. They were in the kitchen, as you recall, from Nicole. Third, at least one witness, Brian Higgins, forgot his narrative, at least for a second, and he admitted a man did, in fact, come into the house. And then when he was caught and asked to describe that man, he had to. It was a little bit vague. You remember what he said. He was tall with dark hair. That was a telling slip of the tongue by Brian Higgins. But what's the real evidence of the unbiased data, the data that's not connected to the Albert family? How about John's Apple Health data? It shows that at 12:21 a.m., an important time, John arrived. That's established by the monotonic time clock that you heard about in this trial that was on his phone, and that represents a huge problem for the Commonwealth. It shows that he took 80 steps and ascended or descended 3 flights of stairs at that time. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It matches. Walks into the house, goes directly to the basement. There's your 80 steps and your descending flights of stairs. The big problem for the Commonwealth is he wasn't outside at the car ascending and descending stairs, wasn't climbing on top of the car. So they'll tell you, wait, don't look at the Apple Health data. Look at this other thing called Waze. But Rick Green explained that if you apply the 3-minute offset that is built into that monatomic time, it aligns perfectly. They don't want you to see that. They don't want you to pay attention. They want you to look the other way. But even more importantly, at approximately 12:32 a.m., someone holding John's phone takes another 36 steps and travels 25 meters. Why is that so important? Because by 12:32 a.m., Karen Reed was gone. She had already left the location. She left at 12:30. Trooper Garino told you that Karen Reed's phone connected to John's Wi-Fi at what time? 12:36. It is undisputed in this case that it's a 6-minute drive on a good day from 34 Fairview over to One Meadows. She was gone by 12:30, and John's phone was taking 36 steps and logging 25 meters at 12:32 after she'd left. So don't be fooled. John walked into that house, after which Karen drove away, and the scientific data all prove it. But also, Ryan Nagel and Heather Maxson prove it. In addition to the Apple Health data, Ryan and Heather both independently testified that they passed Karen's SUV as they drove away after talking to Julie, and Karen was alone in the SUV. John was not with her. He wasn't in the car. He wasn't standing outside the car. He wasn't sitting beside the car. He wasn't laying on the ground beside the car. He was nowhere in sight. There's only one other place that John could have been, and that's in the house. Exactly where the Apple Health data places him. So it all fits. And Ryan was right behind her, remember, staring at her taillights, undamaged, brightly lit. That brings up another difficulty for the Commonwealth, and that's their star witness, Jennifer McCabe. You'll recall that Jennifer McCabe claimed that she was looking out the door, staring at that SUV over and over and over again from 12:29 to 12:50. She was very specific about that time frame. But we know that the SUV was gone from 34 Fairview by about 12:30. Had to be in order to connect to the Wi-Fi at 12:36. So unequivocally, Jennifer McCabe was lying about watching that SUV, and it makes you wonder why. And to add to that deceit, she was also blatantly lying about the calls to John's phone. You remember that colloquy back and forth. She said that every single one of those calls to John's phone during that time was a butt dial. How are those lies connected? And why are they connected? Jennifer McCabe knows. Was she butt dialing John over and over? Or was someone looking for John's phone that went missing? Let's talk for a second about what actually happened in the time leading up to everyone going to 34 Fairview. Brian Albert, Brian Higgins show up drunk at the waterfall. They'd been drinking in the afternoon. You know about the flirtatious texts that were sent between Karen Reed and Brian. Higgins was clearly pining over Karen, but for her, the flirtation had ran its course. It was done. She was happy and committed to John. You could see that in her actions with John that night. You don't have to guess. Brian Higgins, however, you can see in his actions, he wasn't quite so satisfied and he wasn't done. His text message, well, meaning, what the hell, Karen? What about me? Seemed aggressive, seemed annoyed. He didn't like being ignored. That was pretty clear. So he's 5 or 6 whiskeys deep into the night by this time, and she continued to ignore him. Then oddly, Higgins, who doesn't know John all that well, seems to want to coax John to 34 Fairview. I draw your attention to the waterfall tape if you want to take another look at it. It's at the 11:57 mark, between 11:57 and 11:58. Take a look at that tape. He's just about to leave. Higgins is just about to leave. He points over at John and he motions for him. Come on, come with me. And then at 12:20, he texts him, you coming here? This is a person he doesn't really know and didn't really talk to that entire night. Ask yourself, why was Higgins so insistent that John go to 34 Fairview that night? And then there's that sparring and fighting that he and Brian Albert were engaged in. Of all the things they could be doing, this is what they were doing just minutes before John O'Keefe walked into that house at 34 Fairview. We know that once John actually did walk in the door, it's about 2 steps, 4 feet or so, 2 steps for an adult male to reach that basement door. Remember, everybody was gathered in the kitchen. That's what Nicole Albert said. And every single witness agreed that at some point, Brian Higgins and Brian Albert left the group and went to another room. Where did they go? Where did they go together? Another important point. Chloe was not upstairs. Brian Albert slipped in one of his testimony that he provided. Quote, I was watching Chloe downstairs, monitoring her because of the other people in the house. She's not good with strangers. Remember that testimony. So what happened next? We absolutely know that John was in the house. The data, Ryan, Heather, they all established that. We know that John ascended or descended stairs. We know that Brian Higgins and Brian Albert excused themselves. How long does it take to have a crossword? How long does it take to have a fight? How long would it take for Brian Higgins to say to John, you know, your girl's been texting me. A push, a punch, a fall, pull Chloe off his arm, and now it's done. What is that? 5 seconds? 10? Doesn't take long at all. And then the panic sets in. It wasn't intended to go that far, but what's done is done. And then some very, very odd things start happening at the Albert household. Very odd indeed. What do we know? We know through the testimony and key swipes that Brian Higgins very oddly goes directly to Canton Police Department. Why would he do that? After a night of drinking and partying, why go to CPD when you're drunk? What was so important there? He couldn't even get his own story straight. First, he said it was administrative work. Then he said he was moving cars. Then he said it was a factor of both. Is it both? Was it neither? Or was he there to gather intel? Ask yourself, why go? But the odd things keep piling up, and here's another. Chloe was the Albert family pet. Not only did she appear to be gone from the house that morning on January 29th, nobody saw her there. Even Jen McCabe admitted, yeah, I didn't see her there. But they actually got rid of the dog altogether. Within months of this incident, the dog was gone, out of the house, rehomed, never to be seen again. This was a dog they had had for 7 years. Also a dog who had a bite history. Why was it so important to get rid of that dog? Was there something about the dog they did not want law enforcement to find out? Recall what Dr. Russell said. She's seen up to 1,000 animal attacks. In her expert opinion, John's right arm, those injuries are from an animal, quote, most likely a large dog. And Dr. Russell's testimony, I'll remind you, was undisputed by any witness for the Commonwealth. But there are more odd and unexplained things. After a night of drinking and hanging out and partying, after being together for the entire day at 2:22 a.m., Brian Albert decides to call Brian Higgins. That call was missed, but 17 seconds later, Higgins calls Brian back, and they speak for 22 seconds. Now, that call is odd and suspicious enough, in and of itself, the fact that the call was made. But what's even more incriminating is that both men, both of them, lied about the calls happening. They both claim astonishingly that those calls are, you probably say it with me, they're butt dials. Amazing. But Albert and Higgins take it a step further. Not only did they claim that they were making calls as butt dials, but they were answering calls as butt dials. And Higgins seemed awfully defensive about that call, didn't he? Remember on cross-examination when I was asking him, can you have a conversation in 22 seconds? He unequivocally said, no, that's impossible. It's not reasonable. You can't do it. Well, let's test that out. Hey, did you make it over to Canton? Yep. Haven't been any calls. Nobody knows a thing. All right, don't talk to anybody until we talk again. Okay, fine. And by the way, come back over. I need help moving something heavy. How long did that take? 15 seconds? Maybe? But the odd behavior isn't done yet. 5 minutes after that call that we just talked about, Jennifer McCabe is on her phone at her house, Google searching how long it takes for someone to die in the cold. That was at 2:27 a.m. That timeline seems to fit, doesn't it? And it fits a very telling and a very clear story. That search became a focal point of the Commonwealth's entire case. This case was starting to look a lot more like the defense of Jennifer McCabe than anything else. That's probably because there is no innocent explanation for that Google search at 2:27 a.m. None. At the end of the day, clearing away all the confusion, the Commonwealth's experts were left with two things that are true. First, neither of their experts could absolutely rule out that Jennifer McCabe made that search at 2:27 a.m. Neither. And second, the only person to use the actual phone model, the actual data, and the actual precise operating system was Rick Green. And he was clear. That search was at or before 2:27 a.m. And then it was deleted. So what else was going on at or around this same time when all this suspicious activity was happening at the Albert house and the McCabe house? 3 minutes after that search and 8 minutes after the Albert Higgins 2:22 a.m. call, Brian Loughran drives down the street in his snowplow. And he told you that there is no body laying on the lawn at 34 Fairview at 2:30 in the morning. Importantly, he didn't just simply say he didn't see a body, he wasn't paying attention. He said there was no body there. He knows the property, he knows the owners, he's grown up with these folks, he passes by all the time, not once, not twice, 3 passes. There was nobody on that lawn, period, at 2:30 a.m. And what other suspicious thing happened that night? By 3:30 a.m., someone moved a Ford Edge in front of the very area that would obstruct the view of where John's body would ultimately be discovered. Who's the only person in this case that you've heard about with a Ford Edge. Brian Albert. Remember, as you're thinking about this, the basement at 34 Fairview is serviced by a bulkhead. It's a quick and convenient door to the backyard. And that backyard is serviced by a side fence. And that side fence is easily accessible to the front yard at the side of the house. Which side of the house? The side where John's body was found. And by 6 a.m., John's body was, in fact, now outside. While this flurry of suspicious activity was going on with the Alberts and the McCabe's, what's happening with Karen? All she knows at this point, think about it, at approximately 2:21, she dropped off John. He walked into 34 Fairview, and that's all she knows. She knows nothing else that was going on. So what was she left to think? He goes in to check the party out, but all of a sudden he's not coming back. He's not responding. Minutes start to pass. 1 minute turns to 2, 2 turn to 10. Where is he? Why isn't he responding? She's sitting in the cold, dark, freezing outside in the car. Naturally, she's perturbed. Being perturbed turns into being peeved. Being peeved eventually turns into being pissed. By 12:30, Karen's mad. She's left 34 Fairview to make a point, but she's still texting and calling. What could she reasonably be thinking at this point? What's going through her mind? 12:33 turns into 12:34. I can't believe you do this to me. 12:34 turns into 12:35. Where is he? Why aren't you answering, John? 12:35 turns to 12:36. Jesus Christ. I'm calling and you're not answering. Where are you? Pick up the phone. But there's still no answer. There's still no response. By 12:37, she's getting furious. She does not know that something has happened to John. She does not know that. So she leaves the first angry voicemail. Illustrates frustration, aggravation, all the normal responses anybody might have, you and I might have. But little did she know. The next open voicemail has Karen parking at John's garage after she gets home. You can hear her heels clicking across the garage floor. For all she knows at this point, John's just drunk, he's been partying, he's hanging out, just forgot about her, blowing her off. But John's still not responding, and as the minutes tick by, Karen becomes increasingly upset. Those are the voicemails that you heard. How could he do this? Why is he ignoring me? Why is he ignoring the kids? Those are the thoughts bearing down on Karen Reed as she sat in an empty house late at night by herself. Ladies and gentlemen, she did not know what had happened to John. But within the next voicemail, you quickly learn what she was thinking and what she was feeling. Now it's 5:23 a.m. She's woken up. She's realized that he hasn't come home and he hasn't responded to a single text, not a single call. And anger quickly turns to panic and abject fear. She's so distraught, she reaches out to him again. John, where the fuck are you? She says through tears and desperation. And at 6:03, the question was answered and her worst fears are realized when she finds his body laying, dying in the cold in Brian Albert's front yard. You heard her. You can feel the grief. You can feel the raw anguish. You could see it. You don't have to wonder the emotional journey that Karen traveled that night. You can see it in the video. You can hear it in the audio. From the time he left her and walked into 34 Fairview and she called, she reached out 53 times. She called him 53 times before finding his body. Think about that. The Commonwealth wants you to believe that she murdered this man. And then after that murder, she called him not once, not twice, 53 times. It makes no sense. What does make sense is that she emotionally moved from anger, then to panic, then to grief. So back at 5:07, when she began her search looking for John, she backed out of the garage, and what would happen next would change the entire course of this case. As she backed out of that garage, she hit John's Traverse and cracked her right rear taillight. Folks, the Commonwealth has one job to do in this courtroom. It's an immutable responsibility to provide you with the truth. That's it. Not to win the case, but to seek justice and to do it through the truth. Ask yourself, did you get that truth from the Commonwealth? The Commonwealth continually tried to tell you that that video showed that the SUV came close to John's Traverse, and it took us showing you the video to unequivocally establish that Karen hit that car and cracked her taillight at 5:07. You can almost hear an audible gasp in the courtroom when we finally showed you the actual video. You can see that tire move. I'm only going to show you one series of exhibits during my entire closing, but it's that important. And it's this. Look at the condition of her taillight when she pulls out of the driveway at 5:07. That taillight, and I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. That taillight is cracked, but it's not completely damaged. And if there was any question in your mind about the level of damage to that taillight at 5:07, all doubt was extinguished when Dighton Police Officer Barrows walked into this courtroom. He's a sworn officer. He's not associated with Kenton. He's not associated with the Alberts. He's not associated with the McCabe's. He doesn't know Michael Proctor. In other words, he doesn't answer to any of these folks. He's an outsider and he's completely independent. And his words were the following, quote, "That taillight was not completely damaged. It was cracked. A piece was missing, but not completely damaged." Take a look at this photograph and tell me, which one looks like Officer Barrows' description? The one on the left or the one on the right? The reconstructed light on the left is what that light looked like before it was in Trooper Proctor's possession. Remember that. That's what it looked like before Trooper Proctor had access to the SUV. And you have an independent police officer telling you so. You'll recall that after John's body was discovered, Lank, a very good friend of the Alberts, walked into Brian Albert's house and had an off-the-record meeting with him. No one's ever going to know exactly what that meeting was about, what they discussed, because that interview, like everything else in this case, it wasn't recorded. It wasn't memorialized. But we do know that shortly thereafter, the Canton Police Department was recused from the matter entirely. And the case was assigned to one Michael Proctor. You have to believe that when the Alberts found that out, they thought they hit the lottery. They thought they hit the lottery. What are the chances? The department where my brother works, that would have been great to investigate this case, but that department's been recused. That's tough luck. But the guy who catches the case is Michael Proctor, a guy we go back with for decades. At such a break, they probably thought, when this is over, we need to get that dude a gift. Oh, wait a minute. They didn't think that. They said it out loud. But still, you've got to imagine that the Alberts had to be stressed, what with that whole thing about a dead body being on their lawn. That might get some attention. And they had to be wondering, will he set up a crime scene? Is he going to come into the house? Is he going to search the house? Is he going to send in a forensics team? Is he going to interview witnesses? Is he going to take us to the station? Will he take our phones? Will he look at our communications? Will he look at our Google searches? Will he look at our early morning phone calls? Is he going to look in the basement? And Michael Proctor answered every single one of those questions resoundingly. Nope. He's a Boston cop too. And with that, Michael Proctor didn't draw a thin blue line. He erected a tall blue wall. A wall that you can't scale. A wall that Karen Reed certainly couldn't get over. A wall between us and them. A place you folks are not invited. We protect our own. It's us or it's them. And by the way, who's she after all? Nobody. An outsider. This is going to be easy. Or so they thought. Let's look at what Michael Proctor actually did and did not do in this case. One of the consistent issues that's come up throughout this trial is how evidence always seems to be changing and evolving when in Michael Proctor's hands or somebody in his orbit. If it happens once, let's chalk it up to a mistake. Twice, it's starting to look a little bit like incompetence. If that happens every single time, it becomes intentional, which means it becomes corruption. The defense spent some time, we spent some time discussing the tow time that Michael Proctor swore to in affidavits. There was a reason that we believed it was so important, and I want to talk about that for just a quick second. Because this was a concerted effort by Michael Proctor to falsify the time the car was seized so that no one would know that he actually had possession of the car before the first pieces of taillight were ever discovered at the scene. But he got caught. And when he did, the best he could come up with was it was a typo. Like a dozen times, a typo. You'll remember what that testimony was. The truth is that car was in Michael Proctor's possession from about 4:12 in the afternoon. He said it was 4:16 when he finally had to tell the truth or some version of the truth. Those first pieces of taillight were not found until after 5:45 p.m. That is the very fact that Michael Proctor was trying to hide by those falsified affidavits, saying he didn't seize the car until 5:30. But that wasn't Michael Proctor's only manipulation of the investigation. What about Brian Loughran? You met him. Michael Proctor did his level best to not just hide evidence, but to hide human beings from you and from us. Michael Proctor was informed that the plow drivers were out that night. There would be a witness, potentially along 34 Fairview, at the exact times in question. Even Michael Trotta expressly told Michael Proctor that 34 Fairview had in fact been plowed that morning, and by whom. Proctor not only did not interview Brian Loughran, he never disclosed his name in a single report. He hid him. This is a witness who was literally on 34 Fairview at the time in question where a body was found on the lawn. Wouldn't you want to get the truth from an eyewitness? Wouldn't you want to seek that out? Not if you're Michael Proctor, a close friend of the Alberts. If it were up to Proctor, you literally never would have heard of or from Brian Loughran. That's a scary prospect. I want to touch briefly on the additional physical evidence or some additional physical evidence presented by the Commonwealth in this case. You'll recall Christina Hanley. She established to a scientific certainty that the glass on the bumper, which was told to you in opening statement, was going to have something to do with this case. The glass on the bumper was going to match that cocktail glass. She told you unequivocally the glass on the bumper did not match the cocktail glass. They came from two different sources. The glass on the bumper has nothing to do with the cocktail glass. So that glass on the bumper had to get there somehow. It didn't get there by being broken from the cocktail glass. See the point? It had to get on the bumper somehow. It didn't jump up there by itself. And what's really interesting is that there was one piece on the bumper, only one, that matched something else in the case. It was a perfect match to a piece of glass that was supposedly found at the scene. Who do you think had possession of that matching glass? Michael Proctor. So the glass on the bumper had to be placed there. And the only person who had anything close to matching the pieces that had to be placed there is Michael Proctor. You do the math. That leads us to the magic hair. The Commonwealth spent a lot of time bringing in experts about mitochondrial DNA and maternal DNA lines and comparative analyses, and all that sounds really great and really sciencey, except for the fact that it just doesn't matter. Why? Because you would have to believe that that little hair, tiny, tiny little hair, barely perched on the side of that SUV survived nearly 75 miles of a raging blizzard outside. That would be a magic hair indeed. That magic hair means nothing. The DNA means nothing, and that's because the hair was from somewhere else. It certainly was not from a motor vehicle incident at 34 Fairview on January 29th. That hair was placed there. The DNA on the outside of the taillight housing also merits very little discussion. John's DNA would be expected to be found all over that SUV, inside, outside, the exterior, the interior, everything he touched would have had his DNA on it. Here's what's actually important about that DNA. No DNA was found on the interior of that taillight. The taillight that they now claim crashed into his arm and shattered. No blood was found anywhere on that taillight or any taillight pieces. and no tissue was found anywhere on that taillight or any taillight pieces. But we're to believe that that taillight literally exploded on John's arm at 25 miles an hour with 1,000 pounds of pressure. We talked about the evidence doing very funny things when in Proctor's possession or the possession of somebody in his orbit. Now think about the videos that you saw. How many videos appear to be somehow manipulated or altered? Just about every single one of them. Look at the video of the Sally port. Let's take that one, for example, that grainy one. It's missing the exact time that would show the condition of the taillight when it was pulled in to the Sally port. Pretty important time, wouldn't you think? Did someone not want you to see what the condition of the taillight was at that exact time? But the good news is there's a second video. It's much clearer. And it's from the same time frame. We didn't get that one for about 2.5 years into the investigation. Literally, it was after the trial started that one was turned over. And this is important. The Commonwealth introduced you to a person by the name of Yuri Buchanan. They presented video showing what was clearly the right side of the car. They asked questions about the right side of the car. You'll recall, Mr. Lally asked Sergeant Buchanan, did you or Trooper Proctor ever go at or near the right side of that taillight? And while he was asking the question, what appeared to be the right side of the car was looking at you. The video was still up. Buchanan paused, turned earnestly into the microphone, stared at you and said, never. We never went anywhere around that taillight. While he was showing you the right side of the car. And that trick might have worked until we got up to cross-examine him. And only then, on the second day of his testimony, did he have to admit that the video was actually inverted. It was backward. And it was cleverly inverted at that. The timestamp had the proper orientation, which means that timestamp had to be removed, the video inverted, and the timestamp placed back on it. Which means that was done intentionally. That was not a mistake. And when caught in that obvious fabrication, Buchanan doubled down and said, it's exactly the same. You remember that back and forth. It's exactly the same, he said, as if we're stupid. Is it exactly the same, or is it exactly opposite? Ladies and gentlemen, you were lied to. There is no other way to say it. It's inexcusable. It's abhorrent. But it's also a paradigm of everything that the investigators have been willing to do in this case. Lie, obfuscate, manipulate, alter. And when they're caught, they just excuse it away. Doesn't matter. It's the same thing. What's the big deal? Just look the other way. And don't forget, Buchanan is Proctor's supervisor. And he was in that little group chat where Karen Reed's naked photos were being searched for. You know the saying about the apple falling from the tree. Ladies and gentlemen, we haven't even started talking about the taillight yet. You'll recall that at the very beginning of this case, you were introduced to no fewer than 5 CPD officers very early on who searched the scene. None of them, not a single one, found any taillight material at the scene. 0. Stephen Seraph, Sean Good, Stephen Mulaney, Michael Lank, Paul Gallagher, they were all there. They were all walking right around there. They were all looking. They were searching with their eyes. They were searching with their hands. Some said they were searching with their feet. They even used tools, a leaf blower. Not one piece of bright red taillight material was at the scene, not a single piece, but incredibly, over the course of the next 3 weeks, according to Michael Proctor, 47 pieces of taillight material would end up being found, some of which were the size of a salad plate. The CERT team shows up later on January 29th, and according to O'Hara, the first few pieces of taillight were found about 5:45. And here's some interesting testimony that you heard. Who else was there? Who did O'Hara say was there? Well, he said his team was there. We certainly expected that, but then he said there were others. These other mysterious figures, some from Canton PD, some from the Massachusetts State Police, that he could not account for. Heavy coats, big masks, hats. Even Lieutenant O'Hara could not tell who was who, but he did note Canton police officers were there who were unaccounted for. Massachusetts state troopers were there unaccounted for. And during that search, that was overseen by Trooper Tully, Proctor's supervisor, 3 pieces of taillight material were found. That's super important, and I want to concentrate on that for a second. O'Hara said all 3 pieces were in an area about 12 inches square. That's an area about as big as your dinner plate. Tully, however, claimed that 1 red piece was found. About 3 feet away from that was a shoe. About 1 to 2 feet from that was a clear piece of plastic, and a few feet away from that was a red piece of plastic. So we have red, clear, and red over the span of about, added up, probably 10 or 12 feet. Ladies and gentlemen, both of those things cannot be true. Somebody is taking liberties with the facts. Then Lieutenant Tully comes to court and makes this big grand gesture of opening all these evidence bags. These 2 evidence bags in particular represent exactly what we're talking about. Those 3 pieces, red, clear, red. They're marked, they're sealed, they look official. They're not stop and shop bags, thank God. At least they've moved up from that. They've even got evidence tape on them. Who knew? There's evidence tape around here. So this must be real evidence, right? It must be real evidence in this case. And after making that big theatrical display, he opens up the bag with the red pieces and he pulls 2 pieces out. That's okay. Put the 2 red pieces together. Good so far. Then he opens up the second bag under Mr. Lowley's questioning. And you remember he hesitated just a second. Opened that bag and pulled out 1 piece of clear plastic. Then pulled out a second piece of clear plastic with no explanation as to how that could have possibly happened. And he quickly returned all 4 of those back into the bag, sealed them up, and we're done for the day. The next day, I asked about that evidence again. I asked him to open up that bag with the red pieces, and he did the same thing. Pulled out 2 red pieces of plastic. And I said, you'll recall this, I said, look deeper, look closer, sir. Pull everything out of that bag. Would he have had I not suggested it? And then he pulled a 3rd piece of red plastic out of the bag. So miraculously, Trooper Tully's 3 pieces of plastic became 5 pieces of plastic right before your eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, the forces at play that multiplied those pieces of plastic inside those evidence bags are the same forces at play that multiplied the pieces of plastic at 34 Fairview. Think about that. Let that sink in for a second. How easy is it? That's not sloppiness. That's evidence manipulation. That's how over the course of 3 weeks, those pieces of plastic go from 0 to 3 to 5 to 47, ever increasing in size with every single search. Now, knowing all that, ask yourself the looming question, who had access to that taillight, the cracked taillight? Who was it? Go back and watch the Sally Port video. I'll give you the timestamp, 5:37, and see it for yourself. We know that Trooper Proctor, with binder in hand, walked by himself. Once we corrected the video from being inverted, you can see that he walked back by himself to the right rear taillight where nobody could see what he was doing. Higgins' own key swipes put him in the Sally Port that same afternoon and evening. And then the Sally Port video magically skips and Chief Berkowitz appears right next to Proctor at the back of that vehicle in the same spot, and they walk out of the Sally Port together. Where were they going? Remember O'Hara? Unidentified troopers in Canton cops were at the search at 34 Fairview. How hard is it to drop a piece of plastic? We spent a long time talking about the compromised and altered and tampered and manipulated evidence, and now I want to switch and talk a little bit about the true facts in this case, because you did hear some true evidence and true facts. The Commonwealth presented about 67, maybe more, witnesses and expended 30 plus days of trial and 9 weeks of your life. Maybe we're in the 10th week. For what? It should be relatively simple, right? The Commonwealth claims that Karen Reed pulled up to 34 Fairview, John got out of the car, she reversed into him and hit him, and then she drove home. That's 4 facts. It's just 4 facts. That's all it is. What evidence do they actually have to prove that that SUV ever hit John? The answer is none. They don't have any. There's no evidence whatsoever that Karen Reed's vehicle ever struck John O'Keefe or that Karen Reed ever wanted to strike John O'Keefe. In fact, every single piece of material evidence in this case unequivocally proves the opposite. John went into that house. That SUV was not damaged by hitting John, And John's injuries did not come from being hit by a car. That's what the evidence actually shows. The Commonwealth knows that, and they've known it for a long time, and Proctor knows that. And because of that, the Commonwealth just resorts to character assassination and talking for weeks on end about the snow. Let's talk about what the real evidence actually shows, the unassailable science. Let's talk about the truth. Concerning John's injuries first, the Commonwealth's own medical examiner, Dr. Scortibello, could not conclude that John was hit by a car. Think about that. And she would not even say that it was a homicide. She told you without any dispute in this case, quote, evidence pointing toward one manner of death is no more compelling than evidence of a competing manner of death, end quote. Her words, not mine. She went on to say it's just as likely that he was punched and fell backward. His injuries are consistent with that. In fact, in her expert opinion, his injuries are consistent with a physical altercation, as she testified, but they are not, in her words, not classical injuries from an auto pedestrian accident. That by itself is reasonable doubt. But the evidence and the truth goes far further. We introduced you to not one, but two thoroughly credentialed medical examiners or medical experts, Dr. Sheridan and Dr. Russell, both of whom said John's arm injury is consistent with an animal attack. Dr. Russell studied, diagnosed, and treated up to 1,000 animal wounds. She's an expert in animal wounds, and she was unequivocal. Those wounds are from an animal, likely a large dog, which means that John was attacked inside the home where Chloe was. There is no other possibility. And Dr. Sheridan, for his part, with thousands of 13,000 autopsies under his belt, decades of experience as the chief medical examiner who's triple credentialed in anatomical, forensic, and neuropathology, he told you that John's injuries are inconsistent with a motor vehicle accident or incident. They're consistent, however, with a physical altercation. In layman's terms, the science proves John was beaten. That also is reasonable doubt and should end this case. But the facts and evidence don't stop there. Two of the most highly educated and highly qualified engineers you'll ever meet, Dr. Dan Wolf and Dr. Andrew Rinchler, mechanical engineer and a biomechanist. They reviewed this case. They did testing, they did analysis, they evaluated the case scientifically. They were not hired by the defense, not by the Commonwealth. They're completely 100% independent of any party in this case. And they were equally available, by the way, to the Commonwealth. They could have called them. They explained that John's injuries were not caused by being hit by Miss Reed's SUV, and that the SUV was not damaged by coming in contact with John O'Keefe's body. That should end the inquiry right there. Both sides of the equation. From a physics, engineering, and biomechanical standpoint, they established that John O'Keefe was not struck by Karen Reed's vehicle, period. And that is yet another fact that establishes reasonable doubt and should put an end to this case. So instead of calling the ARCA experts, which they had available to them, the Commonwealth chose to introduce you to Trooper Joe Paul. You'll remember his testimony. I think I'm being kind when I say that Trooper Paul's analysis lacked credibility. Trooper Paul lacks the experience, the education, the training, the background, and the knowledge to not only render opinions on these issues, but to even understand the issues themselves. He makes the absurd claim that John was hit on the elbow area of his arm by a taillight. He was spun to the left in a pirouette. His arm stayed on the light long enough for the shards of plastic to explode around him, scratching his arm, even though he was wearing long sleeves, then projecting him 30 feet to the left, but not before making a stop to hit his head on either the curb or the pavement, before coming to his final resting place with his unbroken phone tucked neatly under his body. It's nonsensical. It borders on laughable. Compare that testimony to Dr. Dan Wolf and Dr. Andrew Rinchler. Both PhDs in engineering, both top of their field in accident reconstruction, both published peer review articles on the issues. Both men are highly sought after by the likes of national sports leagues and the United States Department of Defense. And these men are unrivaled in accident reconstruction. What did Dr. Rentschler say before he left the stand? This was even under cross-examination. He said that the physics and the science don't lie. His words were, "You can't deny the science and the physics." John wasn't hit by that car, period. The Commonwealth cannot explain John O'Keefe's injuries. They can't explain his head wound. How did he get the head wound if he landed on snow-covered grass and dirt? And by the way, before Mr. Lally gets up and says it, because I know he's going to, there is zero evidence before you, zero, that cold grass and dirt turns into ice or turns into concrete. Zero. They can't explain the injury above his right eye, that laceration. They can't explain his nose. They haven't even tried to. They can't explain the injury to his tongue, the laceration on his tongue. They cannot explain the injuries to his back, to the back of his hands, the bruises, and certainly they cannot explain the injuries to his right arm. But maybe most importantly, they cannot and haven't even tried to explain the lack of injuries on John's body from the neck down. Nothing. He was pristine. Not a bump, not a bruise, not a fracture, not a broken bone. Nothing to suggest that he was hit by a 7,000-pound SUV going 25 miles per hour. And what of that right arm? According to the Commonwealth's best and brightest, Trooper Paul, John absorbed the entirety of the collision, the whole collision, with that 3.5-ton SUV entirely with his right arm, launching him some 30 feet. But amazingly, the arm suffered no break, no fracture, and didn't even get a bruise. So how are those injuries properly explained? The evidence is simple. John got into an altercation. He was punched. He tried to defend himself by putting his hands up. He may have even scratched his own nose by putting his hands in front of his face to defend himself. His hands were bruised and covering up.
5 minutes, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Your Honor. As he continued, he got hit, punch went through, and he fell to the ground, fracturing his skull. At some point during that altercation, the dog got a hold of him, and the dog was pulled away. Every single injury is answered. Every single injury is explained by that. Ladies and gentlemen, given what we know about the facts and the physical evidence in this case, the actual truth in this case, how did this happen? How did we end up here? We ended up here because of relationships, insider trading, playing the who you know game, and building a tall blue wall, which takes decades and generations. But the real question is it going to continue? Will this festering malignancy that allows a lead detective and his supervisor to gloat and sneer while looking over naked pictures or looking for naked pictures of the woman that they've targeted, will that continue? And the answer should be, not if you have anything to say about it. Michael Proctor is the lead investigator in this case, and much as the Commonwealth might try, they cannot distance themselves from the stench of him on this case and this investigation. Those secret group chats illustrate the quality and character of his investigation. Remind yourself how an, quote, unbiased and an objective investigator, someone who's supposed to be looking for facts. Ask yourself, how did he approach his job? Late at night, sitting there in his office, deviously looking for naked pictures of Karen Reed and talking about her like she's a piece of meat. Talking about her bodily functions, her medical conditions, calling her vile names. I don't even have it in me to repeat what he said about her. He reduced her to an object. And he went further by insulting her. He went further than insulting her, and he dehumanized her. And when he was done betraying that very humanity, he wished for her to commit suicide. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how you frame someone. That's how you dehumanize someone so viciously that you can just pin it on the girl and cover for the homeowner because he's a Boston cop. That's how you rip a person's life apart and sleep like a baby while doing it. And then further that by saying, I hope she kills herself. Ladies and gentlemen, I just began the discussion this afternoon or this morning with a quote about the truth, and I did that because that's what this case is about. Top to bottom, tip to tail, it's about the truth. Not hiding it or concealing it, but exposing the truth. The truth is immutable. It's not a feeling, it's not a whim. It's unflinching, it's unchanging, and it's everlasting. That's why the law is steady. That's why it's not captive to the whims of people drunk with power who think they're above the law, who think they're above scrutiny. That's why you stand as the guardian of justice and the protector of justice. The law demands the very integrity that Trooper Proctor and his investigation lacks, and it requires that you cannot convict Karen Reed unless the Commonwealth has met its incredibly high burden to prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty. And a moral certainty is defined as the highest degree of certainty possible in matters related to human affairs. It's the highest degree possible in your life. That's the level of certainty. And I'll leave you with this. You have the most powerful tool known to American jurisprudence because you have your vote. No one can take that away from you, not me, not the Commonwealth, not the court. You may not have asked to be here, but each of you have given something very special of yourselves. You've agreed to do that, which is the highest calling a citizen can answer in any way. You've agreed to give your community your best. And my question to you is, what will you do with this moment? Ignore the lies and the manipulations, the misogyny, the bias, the lack of evidence? Could you ever do that? Would you ever do that? Or will you say with your verdict, I see the truth and I will not ever look the other way? When you stare the truth down, you'll see that the Commonwealth has not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty, not even close. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen Reed is innocent. Do justice and find her not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jackson. All right, Mr. Lally.
I appreciate everybody. Got more coming later, man. We'll be back if the jury comes to that verdict. We'll get right out here and talk them facts.
We don't do no talking. We know what they do for the viewers. If I took a loss, no, I got it all back. They just wanna talk, so we gonna talk facts. Got it out the mud, got it out the mud. That's the bad guy. Bad guy. Bad guy. That's the bad